Hello and welcome to this latest quick tip tutorial. In this episode we're going to take a look at the 180 rule. One of the first things we all do when we start to shoot video footage is Google cinematic settings, and the first thing that we're all bombarded with is this so-called 180 rule, this law where if you break it, the drone police will turn up, stamp on your drone, and even the slightest deviation will make your footage look rubbish, supposedly. Well, let's take a look at the facts. So what is the 180-degree rule? Well, the rule states that you must shoot at 24 frames per second because that's the only way you can get cinematic footage. And it also states that your shutter speed must be 2 times your number of frames per second, which we don't have 1/48th, so that's 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Any deviation from this according to the rule and your footage will look rubbish. So where did this rule come from? Well, it dates back to old film cinema cameras, which had a rotating physical shutter. The shutter was half of a disc, i.e. 180 degrees, and this meant that the film was exposed for as long as it wasn't exposed. In other words, the shutter speed was twice the frame rate. This was a simple design and it worked. The problem is, if you wanted to change the shutter speed, it would require you to take the camera apart and install a different shaped disc, and probably also alter the speed at which the film advances through the camera, and this just wasn't practical. And hence the 180-degree rule was born. So where does 24 frames per second come from? Well, Thomas Edison decided that 46 frames per second was the number needed so that you didn't see the flicker between frames. But physical film was expensive, so they decided to shoot at 24 frames per second and then use a double-bladed shutter to project the film at 48 frames per second. In other words, they showed each frame twice before advancing onto the next frame. So 24 frames per second came about basically because they were too tight to shoot at a faster frame rate. There was another issue that 24 frames per second could easily be divided into half a second being 12 frames, quarter of a second being 6, etc. So is a rule that came about in the 1900s still applicable to our high-tech devices these days? Well, in order to test it, I set the Mini 2 drone to do an orbit of Castle Hill. I used the quick shot function so that there would be consistency in the speed and movement of the drone. I shot it at 30 frames per second to deliberately break the 180 rule, but I followed shutter speed in the first clip at 1/60th. I then doubled it to 1/20th, doubled it again, and doubled it again. So, according to the rule, you should be able to see a big difference in these 4 clips. The shot contains different speeds of movement. The background's moving quite fast, so should in theory be showing a lot of stutter, whereas the castle's moving quite slow, so you've got a whole range of movement to try and decide whether this makes a difference to your footage or not. I don't know how easy it's going to be to see the difference when you're watching this video, but to my eyes, if anything, the 1/60th of a second and the 1/120th of a second maybe look jerkier, which is probably down to the way that shutters work on cameras now. Unless you've got a global shutter, the shutter works like a set of blinds going up and down, and you get the rolling shutter effect, where the top of the picture is taken earlier than the bottom of the picture. Another reason I believe the 180 rule is outdated is because now we have 4K cameras and we all like to shoot in 4K. Why do we do that? We do that to get extra sharpness and detail in our images. And then we're cutting our shutter speed down to try and blur those images, which makes no sense. So what is the best shutter speed for cinematic video footage? Well, the best shutter speed is the one that gives you the best exposure. You also need to take into account your artistic desires. If you're wanting to blur the motion in the video, then go as slow a shutter speed as you can. If you're wanting your video to be sharp, then go for the faster shutter speed. Increase the frames per second to maybe 60 frames per second. There is no rule that suits all situations. You need to decide what you want your video to look like. If you're flying smoothly and slowly, then the shutter speed really isn't going to make any difference. In my opinion, the best way to get cinematic footage is to fly smoothly, slowly, and just choose whatever shutter speed gives you the best exposure to maximize your sensor's potential. So I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, then click on my ugly mug to subscribe. Hit the thumbs up so YouTube can recommend this to other people. And I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for watching. Bye.